So, where you been? I do apologize for not having been here in a while. I've been off. I was telling Daniel and Holly that I just finished a series at a Methodist church in Ashermann called Life is Sacrament. And I think a lot of these readings, these two readings that we have today, three readings we have today, kind of fit into that whole theme. And I want to focus on a couple of lines in the two readings, one from Romans and one from Matthew. First of all, let's talk about Romans and talk about Paul, just for a second. Let's put it in perspective of where he is. Paul's writing this letter from Corinth. He's on one of his missionary journeys. Things ain't going real well in Rome. There's stuff going on. There's different sects. There's different groups. At the same time, we always have to remember in the early church, there were the Jews who followed Jesus. They were the original members of the Jesus movement. They were Jews. Peter and Paul, they were all Jews. And now we had begun to see Gentiles, and we use Gentiles in quotes, by the way, because it just means someone who's not Jewish. It could be Greek, it could be... And Gentiles are beginning to follow the Jesus movement at the same time. And what we're finding, especially in Rome, is the debate is taking place over whether or not the Gentiles coming in have to follow the Jewish law. And this is an important part of what Paul is writing, why Paul is writing. The Jewish laws, incidentally, there's 613 of them. And the Jewish law said that to be a member of the Jewish Jesus sect, the Jesus movement as a Jew, you were circumcised. The Gentiles were not. And this sect said, if they want to be part of us, they've got to follow the laws, and it includes things, including things like circumcision. And you know the story of how Peter and Paul both have had these conversations about God calling everyone under the tent. Remember the story of Peter being on the roof, and all of a sudden the tent comes out of the sky, and it's got all the stuff in it, and the voice says to Peter, kill and eat, Peter. And Peter says, I would never eat this. This is all a violation of Jewish law. And Peter interpreted this to mean that God was calling everybody. So these debates are going on, and Paul is writing this letter to some extent to at least straighten some things out and make sure that everyone realizes that we're all called to the same thing. Now, he asks the question, or he talks about how we all have different gifts. It's an important part of this piece of the Roman story, the letter, the epistle to the Romans. So we all have gifts. If you look around this church, we kind of epitomize that. We all have different gifts. We have priests, and we have readers, and we have people who set the table, and we have people who even put up the beautiful medieval architecture behind the altar to create a sanctuary. We all have gifts. And Paul is saying in this letter that we all have different gifts, and we need to follow them, and we need to use them in the service of God. Now, I'm often accused of deconstructing the Bible. And deconstructing is a negative word. Deconstructing means I read into it what I want to read into it. And I prefer to call it reconstructing, because it doesn't do me any good to read this story about the gifts if I can't make it applicable to my life, if I can't use this. So I prefer to look at this as Paul saying two things, not just one. I think Paul is saying to us, we're all given different gifts and we should use them. But I think Paul is also saying to us, you are who you are. You are who you are. And though Paul is the one who's always accused of being the most conservative on things like gender and other issues like that, I believe Paul is saying to us, you are who you are, and you can't change who you are. Now, we jump forward to Matthew, where Jesus asks the disciples, who do you say that I am? And we have different questions, don't we? Because Jesus is asking a very specific question to the disciples. Who does everyone else say I am, and who do you say I am? And I'd like to look at that question and turn it a little bit as Jesus saying to me, who do I say that I am? So if we look at we are who we are, and who do I say I am, we have kind of a different message being given here. And all of it boils down to one line in the Romans letter. In my mind, it all boils down to one line in the Romans letter. Paul is saying to us, you are who you are, you have gifts and use them. Jesus is saying to us, who do you say that you are and who do you say that I am? And Paul says in the letter to Romans, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by renewing your minds. See, I believe what Paul and Jesus are saying to us is that who we are is different than everybody else. That we don't conform to what the world says. And that's hard work. The world says we should own everything we can. We should drive the biggest cars. We should be as rich as we can. We should be famous, and we should be seen as famous people or special people. The Jesus story, and Paul and Jesus are saying exactly the opposite. They're saying, do not conform to this world, but rather conform to the Jesus story and the Jesus teaching. So when he asks us the question, who do you say that I am? He's really asking us to take a hard look at who we believe he is and who we believe we are. The most important part of that is, who do we believe he is? And that is hard work. That requires us to think. That requires us to really try to understand who Jesus is in our life. How does Jesus impact everything we're doing? How does Jesus help us not conform to this world? So, as we look at Paul's letter to the Romans, and we look at Jesus' speaking to the disciples, we see kind of an umbrella around identity. What does the identity of a Christian look like? And what does my identity within that umbrella look like? And how do I answer the question, who do you say that I am? And how do I answer the question, who do I say that I am? Our lives as Christians are very different. And our lives as Christians are easy to identify, though, because our lives as Christians are nonconformist. Our lives as Christians are lives of compassion and love and simplicity. If we read on in this letter to Romans, we would see that Paul kind of delivers his own Sermon on the Mount. Because right after this section in which he says we all have different gifts and we should use them for God, he begins to talk about what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. And he talks about love, and he talks about compassion, and he talks about forgiving, and he talks about loving our enemies. Essentially, he delivers his own Sermon on the Mount, per se, in which he describes how he believes Jesus is calling us. It's kind of like the gospel of Paul. All of those things that Paul calls us to are nonconformist. All of those things Paul calls us to are answering the question, who do you say that I am? Because the Messiah calls us to a different way of life. The Messiah calls us to a way of life of love and compassion and simplicity and forgiveness.